You don't feel drained because you're tired. You feel drained because something in your environment keeps pulling on you, quietly, consistently, and without your permission. It's not always obvious. No one is shouting at you. Nothing dramatic is happening. But the moment certain conversations begin or certain people appear, something inside you tightens. Not loudly, not emotionally, just enough for your nervous system to notice before you do. And the confusing part is, you can't always explain why. Because on the surface, nothing seems wrong. But your body is already reacting to something your mind hasn't fully understood yet. This gap between what you consciously register and what your body already knows is one of the most underexamined sources of chronic psychological exhaustion. And understanding it changes everything about how you relate to your own energy, your own attention, and the people you allow into proximity with your inner life. Here is where the science becomes genuinely interesting. The human nervous system does not evaluate situations the way a rational analysis does. It doesn't weigh evidence, construct arguments, or wait for sufficient data before rendering a verdict. It pattern matches, rapidly, automatically, and with a bias toward anything that has previously cost you something, emotionally, psychologically, or energetically. Long before your conscious mind has assembled a coherent thought about why a particular conversation feels heavy, your body has already cross-referenced thousands of stored relational experiences and returned its assessment. That tightening you feel is not weakness. It is not oversensitivity. It is your nervous system doing its job with remarkable efficiency. But something interesting happens when you sit with this idea a little longer. Because if the body is this sophisticated, if it is genuinely tracking relational patterns below the threshold of conscious awareness, then the feeling of being drained is not a random inconvenience. It is a signal, a specific, directional signal that something in your environment is drawing on your resources in a way that your deeper self has not consented to. The question is not how to stop feeling it. The question is how to read it accurately. Most people, when they encounter this kind of low-grade depletion, frame it as a personal failing. They assume they are too sensitive, insufficiently resilient, or simply not emotionally equipped for the ordinary demands of social life. This interpretation is not just unhelpful. It is, psychologically speaking, precisely backwards. Because the sensitivity of this kind is not a deficit in the architecture of a person. It is, in many cases, evidence of a finely calibrated perceptual system, one that registers subtlety, detects incongruence, and notices when the emotional content of a situation does not match its surface presentation. Think about the way a seismograph works. It is not the instrument's flaw that it registers tremors too small for ordinary human perception. That is its entire function. Its sensitivity is its value. The problem only arises when no one is watching the readings, when the instrument keeps recording without anyone translating the data into understanding. Many deeply perceptive people live this way for years. Their nervous systems are registering significant information, but because they have no framework for interpreting it, they experience the signal not as insight, but as noise. Not as intelligence, but as anxiety. This is where the psychological project shifts from management to understanding. There is a particular category of relational drain that deserves its own careful attention, and it is not the obvious kind. It is not the loud argument, the visible conflict, or the person who is openly demanding or critical. Those situations are exhausting, certainly, but they are at least legible. The more insidious depletion comes from something quieter, the relationship or environment in which a subtle but persistent pressure exists to be a slightly different version of yourself. Not dramatically different, just adjusted, just slightly smaller, slightly more agreeable, slightly less of whatever quality in you makes the other person uncomfortable. This pressure is rarely stated explicitly. It operates through tone, through the quality of pauses, through which parts of you receive warmth and which parts are met with a particular kind of silence. Over time, navigating this kind of environment requires a continuous low-level expenditure of energy. The energy of self-monitoring, of editing, of maintaining a version of yourself that is acceptable to the surrounding atmosphere. And this expenditure is exhausting precisely because it is invisible. You cannot point to it. You cannot name a single incident. But the cumulative cost is real, and your body has been keeping the account long before your mind acknowledged the debt. This is where the concept of psychological safety becomes more than a workplace buzzword. At its core, psychological safety is not about comfort. It is about the energy cost of presence. In an environment where you are genuinely safe, where your authentic responses are not a liability, simply being there costs you relatively little. The cognitive and emotional resources you might otherwise spend on self-management remain available for everything else, for thinking clearly, for engaging creatively, for being genuinely present with another person. In an environment where that safety is absent, even if only subtly, the overhead is constant. The system is always running a background process. It can never quite close. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. Because the environments that drain us most are rarely the ones we chose carelessly. They are often the ones we entered for good reasons, out of love, out of loyalty, out of genuine aspiration. The colleague whose opinion matters to you. The family member whose approval you have sought for longer than you can remember. The friendship that contains real history, real warmth, and also a particular dynamic that has never quite resolved itself into ease. These are not relationships you can simply exit, nor, in many cases, would you want to. But they are relationships that require a more sophisticated psychological strategy than either endurance or avoidance. That strategy begins with the practice of returning to yourself, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a quiet, continuous habit. The capacity to notice, in real time, that your interior state has begun to shift in response to an external pressure and to gently reorient toward your own ground before the shift becomes a displacement. Psychologists sometimes call this effect regulation, but in lived experience, it feels less like a technique and more like remembering. You are simply remembering who you are, beneath the layer of response that the current environment has activated. Think of it as the difference between a river and a canal. A canal is shaped entirely by its constructed banks. It flows only where the architecture permits. A river has its own momentum, its own direction, its own relationship with the landscape it moves through. It can be influenced by the terrain. It adjusts, but it retains its fundamental nature as it moves. The goal is not to become impervious to your environment. The goal is to remain, fundamentally, a river. What begins to accumulate, as this orientation becomes more habitual, is something that functions less like a defensive strategy and more like an internal reference point. A place inside yourself that you can return to, regardless of how much the surrounding atmosphere is pulling in various directions. This reference point is not built through isolation. It is built through repetition, through the repeated practice of noticing when you have drifted and choosing, without drama or self-criticism, to return. The relationships and environments that currently cost you the most are not simply obstacles to manage. They are, in a precise sense, maps of where your sense of self is still vulnerable to external definition, where you are still, at some level, waiting for permission to be fully what you are. And rather than being causes for shame, these maps are genuinely useful. They show you exactly where the work of self-understanding still has depth to explore. So you come back to that original moment, the tightening, the quiet contraction, the signal your body sent before your mind had found the words. And you understand now that it was never irrational. It was never oversensitivity. It was your most intelligent system, doing the most important thing it knows how to do, telling you the truth about your experience before the part of you that makes excuses had a chance to intervene. The exhaustion you have been carrying is real, but it is not evidence of weakness. It is the accumulated weight of places where you have been present without being fully yourself. And the path through it is not an escape. It is the slow, patient, deeply worthwhile work of learning to stay, in relationship, in the world, in connection with the people who matter to you, while remaining, quietly, and without apology, entirely who you are.